This podcast, Strange, Rare, and Peculiar, is for kind of those in the know about homeopathy, deepening your knowledge, bringing you more information about what you need to know and maybe what you can leave aside about homeopathy.
Homeo what?
Homeo what?
Hello, folks.
Here we are.
Good afternoon, good morning, good evening.
We're
wherever you
recording
are.
on a Sunday morning.
It's a Sunday morning. Can I please have that cashew milk?
We are having a beautiful chai tea. We were gifted this dirty chai some time ago, not too long ago, and it's got these beautiful broken cardamom pods in it, and I made some homemade cashew chia milk.
Oh,
How
that's
is
good.
it? Is it good?
Damn.
Yeah.
Nice. Hey, we're talking about education, aren't we?
The basics of education.
And I'm going to take my hat off, I think, for this.
Get all heated up. The intellectual juices are coming out the top of your head.
Well, I'm excited because this is my sweet spot.
I mean, so much so that you have a PhD in this. You're the world expert because you're the only person who's thought to do a PhD in the intersection of, let's see if I can get this right, learning technologies and integrative medicine. Is that close?
That'll do. That's not bad.
That'll do, pig.
It turned out to be learning technologies, but also practice technologies. The technologies that we all interface with in our clinical practice.
I forgot about that. I mean, that's a big deal for 21st century homeopaths.
Oh, it sure is. Yeah, totally. But that's a little different to part of what we want to talk about. I mean, sure, we'll talk about the fact that we are in the 21st century and engaging in technologies, but I want to talk about curriculum as well.
And I want to talk about student experience and sort of what it takes. But actually, as we are getting ourselves set up, I do think that the technology part is important because this new sort of in the past couple of weeks, the AI, the chatbot situation has just sort of exploded out. And there's a way in which I think people can look at the technology we use in homeopathy to think it gives us answers, when in reality, it's the development of human potential and critical thinking that gives the answers. We have to be able to use that technology to our advantage. So maybe if there's time, we could tack some of that on as experience.
For sure.
Okay.
But I think for me, I've had an interesting odd week because I did some student interviews, recruitment interviews.
Yeah.
For potential students potential learners want to join us for later in the year. And
at AHE.
And the Academy of Homeopathy Education. And at least twice this week I was asked, it wasn't really a question, but it got me thinking about how did it happen. But the question, the statement was, I want to study with you because of your curriculum. And it's really interesting because we don't show folks our curriculum. I mean, we talk about it.
Yeah.
But there's something that happens in our talking about what we do, where the educational seriousness comes through in some way.
Right.
And I was really kind of struck by that, because a curriculum is not really just a list of topics. A curriculum is an arc and a flow, and especially...
and there's accountability to it.
A progression, a learning progression.
Yeah.
But you're totally right. And accountability. And I don't know, because I don't know if you know some of the early stories I had of learning education, which was not my experience of teaching homeopathy.
Or learning homeopathy.
Oh, definitely not.
Even though, I would argue that, and we've talked about this in prior podcasts, that, there is such respect for the people who kept homeopathy going, especially in the realm of education, when homeopathy had really hit a dip and it only started to spring back up in, the 1970s and 80s, and then on into the 90s, which your entry point was what year again?
I started studying homeopathy in 1989.
89. Yeah. Mine was a few years later, informal study, followed by distance, or what then was called correspondence study, followed by in-person study, and then on to a more rigorous in-person program. And I think we both experienced sort of the searching for the educational environment that really suited us for where we were in our life.
Well, for me at that time, have I told you the story? I wrote to Vathulkas.
Oh, yeah. But I think you should tell it here. Or maybe you shouldn't. I don't know. If you do, tell it in from your best place, from your heart.
From my heart.
From your heart.
My wounded heart.
Not your ego. How's that?
Okay.
No,
because I had a pretty impressive experience. I think we've talked about this before.
Everybody knows your sneeze experience.
I know, it didn't help this morning. Jeez, I whacked out a couple of good sneezes. But that's just about temperature. It's not...
It's not hay fever. I know. But
anyway, the point is that I decided that this was the thing I was going to do.
Yeah.
And so I wrote 3 letters.
Yeah.
One was to Vathulkas. One was to Greg Follis.
I don't know who that is.
Greek. New Zealander.
Okay.
Kiwi. And one to... I think it must have been at the time... either the Australian or Australasian College of Natural Medicine, as it was known there, ACNT, or it might have been Nature Care in Sydney. And I, it was just like a dear sir, one of those letters. And I got a reply back from Vathulkas that said, nah.
Was he only teaching physicians?
Yeah, exactly.
But he's not a doctor.
Correct. But, and that's his own journey.
Yeah, I mean,
whatever.
He's an engineer.
Yeah.
So, it never sort of made sense to me, but whatever. I mean, I sort of get it. And I want to actually talk about, because I actually have respect for the criteria, the entry criteria.
Yeah.
Right? Because I think that's important. And yet, foreshadowing later parts of the conversation, entry criteria does not guarantee success in the educational process or in practice, which is kind of funny. Anyway, do proceed.
Pray continue. No, and so very long story short, I then made a call once, and Misha picked up the phone. Yeah. And so, because where I was, there was only one school, which is in the far north of New Zealand. Or there might have been another one, I can't remember at the time. And I was in the deep south, and that for some reason mattered back then. And so I began, like you said, studying correspondence school. And look, it engaged me, and it was fine. I got those cassette tapes in the mail. And then those envelopes, I remember those envelopes.
I was just going to say, do you remember the excitement when it would arrive? I remember, after writing to get to start, and when I received the first package, I was ecstatic because there wasn't, put it in context, there's no internet.
But when you think about that experience, that was a school that was ahead of its time.
Well ahead.
And of its time, but ahead of its time, 90s, let's say early 90s. But the thing that they did really well was the packaging and the speed, and to an extent, I mean the waiting for responses, written responses to assignments that you finished and sent off 2 months ago. I think it was probably pretty up there for its time.
Oh, totally.
And actually, in terms of accessibility and availability, that was all there was. And so, I'm kind of grateful for that. But it was really interesting because it wasn't, as I learnt later, the thing that I loved about that school and that education process was not the curriculum. All right? And it took me probably another almost 20 years to work that one out. So because you're going to get a job offer at some point. You're going to get your master's, and the next day you're going to get a job offer. That's what happened with me. Did you know that?
I did know that. Yeah.
Yeah. So,
but I think you should talk about the details of it.
Yeah. So the day I graduated, or at least I got the letter saying, I graduated from my master's.
You finished. You got all the boxes ticked.
I got taken out for dinner by Isaac Golden, and he laid out for me a vision, and it was a compelling vision.
Can you just say who he is for people who don't know?
Yeah, so Isaac Golden, Dr. Isaac Golden, is a timeless man. He could be 110 or he could be 50.
Yeah.
And I reckon he's somewhere in the middle. And he's has spent a lot of his time, most of his time, perhaps in southern Australia and Victoria, and began studying seriously the phenomena of homeoprophylaxis back in, I'm going to say the 80s, but that's a guess, and forgive me if I got that wrong. Anyone who knows better. But, and then, made a name for himself around the world.
And continues to this day.
Yeah, and continues to do so. But he was also known to me because he ran one of the homeopathy schools in Australia. It was he called it at the time his correspondence school.
Oh, really?
Yeah. In fact, he called it the Coro School.
Because in Australia, you have to shorten everything.
Yeah.
Coro, avo.
Oath. Yeah, you do. And I was, at that time, working in the Sydney College of Homeopathic Medicine as their, I don't know, on the academic side. I can't remember what I was called. Yeah. And so, and he said, look, my school's been bought. We want to make an offer on the school that you represent was my school.
Yeah.
And I was introduced to this kind of this crazy world of private equity getting involved in homeopathy education, which is a different story for another day. And so one thing led to another, and I signed up, and I got my first job. And, I remember the salary, at the end of the week coming in, it was just
But
crazy
I think it's
time.
important to say it was your first sort of, it was a job where you had, a contract and you had the expectation to turn up every day, as opposed to the freelance careers that most of us have had in
teaching
homeopathy.
homeopathy.
Exactly.
So I had, by then, a good decade or so of turning up to whoever school and either teaching their curriculum or teaching my own material to their students that would be there. And I had hundreds and hundreds and thousands of hours of teaching by that time. And so I felt pretty good about myself. And I think I had somewhat of an inflated ego about these matters.
Oh, dear.
And so then I was suddenly running a department in in the university sector in an Australian institution. And I remember my first couple of meetings, and I can't remember in what order it happened, but I realised, oh my God, I don't know anything about education. And so I know a bunch about how homeopaths have been taught, but I didn't know. And so when it happened, it was somewhat of a humiliating experience, but I had shreds tore off me in some sort of formal academic meeting, where it became clear that I did not understand basic, people would say pedagogy, but it's actually andragogy, pedagogy meaning teaching kids. Yeah. And I was insisting on the fact that our first lecture in homeopathy school needed to be on the Laura Civilis. And it might have been the first remedy, might have been sulfur.
Sulfur, I know. Which I still can't believe. It was the first remedy that I was taught.
It's the first remedy most people get taught.
Yeah.
Or if it's a different school, you dive into the mineral remedies or whatever it might be. And so this woman who was, in terms of the institution, extremely high up in the hierarchy in terms of compliance, said, young man, you need to pull your head in, and you need to understand that students that arrive in this school will only learn foundational information on day one. And then you can start to integrate that information in the middle of their degree, and then they can apply it at the end. And that's what we are doing. So
hello.
I got a big slapping. And anyway, sorry about turning that into a long story, but I must have had 100 experiences like that, where I realised that what I'd experienced and what I think most homeopaths have experienced is from a taxonomy point of view. So taxonomy meaning, the ways or the skills that you learn depending on the parchment, the credential you end up getting. You've got to be teaching to that educational level. So if you're describing something, you describe it. But what happens in homeopathy is on day one, we teach an extremely complex concept of symbols.
Well, I mean...
If you're not doing it well, that concept is emphasized and is made very, very complex at the very beginning of a program, which is, from a purely educational point of view, kind of unsound.
So I want to put this into some context, right? Because I really appreciate your honesty around, getting the slapping and sort of taking it for the team of decades of homeopathy teaching that, in all fairness, we loved. I loved nothing more than just turning up to listen to these incredibly charismatic people, right? But at the end of the day, one of the things that we've seen is that, and this is the impetus for us in 2015 when we had the opportunity to put our money where our mouth was, or our mouths where our money was. Actually, there was no money, so we just had to do the job. But it was why, the question that we kept asking was, why do so many really smart people turn up, spend a lot of time and energy and money to study something that they are absolutely passionate about, and then they can't do it in the end? And people were frustrated. And I think what we've seen over the last 20-some years, I would say it's in the last 20-some years, is that lots of people were trying to say, okay, well, then I better put my spin on it. So each sort of successful person in homeopathy looked inward to their own success space and put it outward as their personal brand of homeopathy, which means that 20, 30 years later, what you have is this sort of hub and spokes where you've got this centralized hub of homeopathy, which, as I've been known to say, is an actual thing with its own laws, based on natural law, and where we've been given mandates on its execution. But all these people who really mean well and have meant well and who are passionate, which means that they inspire people, right? But not everybody can do the same thing as these passionate people have turned out to do.
Well, because you're learning a skill.
Yeah.
And that's an educational process.
Exactly.
Now, it's interesting because, if I can weigh on in again.
Yeah.
Because try and stop me. You could, would you mind passing the chai?
Yeah. You want some more chai?
I think
yeah.
Because what you just described there is a sort of teaching the sort of learning, I'm going to say the sort of teaching you would get if you went to see a spiritual master and you sat on the floor and listened and was totally inspired. But is that teaching a skill that needs to be applied in a health setting? In Australia, I realized, and deep into my career, that, and everywhere else where I was teaching as well, that there was no agreement on were we teaching a competency,
right,
or were we teaching a degree. And that difference between vocational learning and higher educational learning has also got to be spoken about and understood because I realized that on a Saturday I might be teaching at this school and teaching a competency. Now that means that you are in the same educational space as a tractor driver,
right,
or a hairdresser.
Well, you know this because you were teaching in an institution that had accountability to the Ministry of Education that was actually providing money.
Right. Well,
right?
They were. Absolutely. And then that accountability was really, really important.
Well,
but the criteria in that and the way that you assess a student. So what we were talking about before was the teaching of something.
Yeah.
But the learning of something
means
assessment. And that means, and so as a consequence of that, if you're teaching competency-based learning, homeopathy, that means, can you cut hair straight?
Yeah.
Do you, now repeat back to me what the law of similars is, right?
Yeah.
That's what that style of education is. But homeopathy education is not just taught there around the world. It's sometimes taught in institutions that offer degrees.
Right.
And that is a very, very different space. That is, now demonstrate that you can identify, describe. Now I want you to critically think.
So I want to, this is really important though, because there are people that would say, oh, you're just teaching to a test, which I would object to that whole cloth.
Well, in competency-based education, very often you might be.
Well, except that if you're teaching at what you would call level 6, right, which in the American system, we don't really have. I've had to sort of learn this from teaching in the British system and also learning from
you translate. So level 6 is what? Well,
what I would say is that, well, actually, I'm going to come to that in a second because I think that what we've been grappling with, you and I, in our conversations about this for some time now, is how do we take passionate people through both an educational journey, a self-development journey, and be able to, at the end, say that we've done our job in saying, you're paying money for an educational product. You need to be able to know what it is, what the expectations are, and how you can demonstrate your proficiency in the end and do the job. Well, because now there's a job to be done. Back in the day, I'm still amazed when I think about people. Well, we just had somebody come to us recently to say, hey, can you float me some clients because I can't get 10 clients to get to my certification level. And we're like, well...
From another school.
Yeah, from another school. Yeah. And we've got waiting lists where we're saying, hey, we've got so many clients. Please, who's ready? Who can take one? So
I want you to say that whole thing again, because what you just said was magic. Because I don't believe a great school is only about the curriculum.
It can't be.
Right.
It can't be. There are a lot of ingredients, but I want to, because where I'm thinking about this, and as I always love when we sit down to do this, is you and we talk all day long about this sort of thing, in little bits and pieces, and then when we sit down, this podcast experience is one where we're actually holding each other accountable in a way to articulate these thoughts that we have in bits and pieces in a way that needs to be translated to other people, right?
And which is they don't understand everything that I'm talking about?
We help each other out over here. Uh-huh. Okay, so the thing is, though, that what I want to go to is you were talking about sort of the ways in which homeopathy can be and has been taught almost as if it's a school of spiritual enlightenment.
Right.
And so what I would go back to is to say, and some of, my students over time have heard me say that inherent in the word disciple is discipline. Mm-hmm. And Hahnemann would say this over and over again and would rail against the half homeopaths, or, I love anytime he uses the term mongrel. But I think that what is asked of us, because homeopathy is different. It's not just about accountability in, the keynotes of this remedy and the application of this principle, but it's a deep experience to not learn homeopathy, but to become a homeopath. Mm-hmm. And so what's asked of educators is multifaceted. And it is to both hold the space of educational accountability, right? Because people are coming to you to learn something. As you said, can you cut hair straight? Mm-hmm. But also, can you sit in the face of human suffering? Mm. Can you comport yourself in a way that you understand what it means to listen, to translate that into 18th and 19th century medical principles that are not just about the material substance or the material world, but you've got to use your decoder ring to actually get to the energetics of things. So it's like, makes your head spin, right?
Your Bible fish.
Oh, here we go again. I love that. Okay, so can I go further just a little bit to talk about curriculum? Mm-hmm. Because I'm super visual about these sorts of things, and when you and I sat down to talk about and to deconstruct our experiences as students of homeopathy, mm-hmm. and the education that we got must have been good, because here we are decades later still doing it. Then we've got our experience, how we ourselves sort of put it forth, and then becoming teachers, and then becoming sort of developers of this experience of education. And I'll never forget a series of conversations that you and I had starting in 2011, when we first met, and we were talking about methodology and practice, right? But then going forward to 2014, because our first conversations, I reached out to you as a person who was directing an educational institution that was going through some challenges, some pretty, really huge challenges. And I got permission from that institution to reach out to you as a person who had their feet firmly planted up to the waist, really, in the hierarchical educational institutions and what were required. Because I recognize that in order for this institution to meet the standards in America, where students were going to be able to show their not just educational competencies, but their clinical competencies. And in this case, because it was an international institution, there was, there is so much about the experience of the country that you're in, and another time we can talk about how we managed to do that, having an international student body, but being, sort of grounded in this, the model of American education. Conversation for another day. But what you and I, from those early conversations, really got into talking about was how do you make people successful? What are the skills and attributes of a good homeopath, and what has to happen in order for them to exit and be able to do it as a job? Because I just felt in my heart we couldn't.
And sorry for butting on in, but the answer was so obvious. It's repetition, repetition.
And clinical training of repetition. But here's the thing I want to say.
In other words, to create confidence. And
based on competence.
Correct.
Because you know what I always say. When your confidence outweighs your competence, you should increase your liability insurance. Because what I saw time and again was the people who were successful were people who were going to be successful in whatever they did. Right. And there would be these people who, I'm sorry to say, were not the stellar students in programs that I taught, who went on to be incredible because they were what now we would call influencers. And they just peddled their influence. They got people to follow them because of their own charisma, and whether or not they were actually successful in putting people's healthcare forward onto a higher level or not didn't matter, because they created what was essentially like the sort of guru thing.
Well, which really, I've never thought of that before.
Yeah. Oh. And so what happened was, and I guess where I started, and it took me a little bit to get there because, the wind up, but was you and I were drawing out what a curriculum looked like. And I drew you, I don't know if you remember this, but the spiral, the way that I saw homeopathy education as a spiral.
All I remember is the hollering, because you might have drawn me a spiral, but I got totally caught up in the fact that you ripped me a new one, because I'd written in that book that homeopathy education was a mess. Do you remember?
Oh, yeah. Well, that's why I had a total cow. I've never been so mad at you. Okay, I can think of one other time, but, in a lot of years. Oh, that's the day I didn't get off the bus. I'm going cross town in New York. I missed the bus. I ended up over on the far west side. I had to come back. I was late. I was so mad. But But in reflection, I realized that parts of it are a mess. And I was very monofocused in the experiences that I was having in what now I realize is a Sisyphean attempt to recreate homeopathy education. And I felt like I was turning out some good students was asking those questions.
I think actually to someone like that, to someone that is creating a great product, like a really good, competent and confident student, that must have been a tough sentence to read. Well, I actually still stand by it, but
here's the thing, and this is my own, Mrs. Magoo walking around. I had no idea what the rest of it looked like, and because I always want to say, do the right thing and always assume that people are acting to their highest self, I actually assumed that everybody else was doing that. And I didn't understand. But can we talk about what that image was, what we came up with? Right. Is that okay?
Yeah.
So the way that it sort of came to me, and in my mind I saw it really clearly, was that education has to be a spiral. In other words, you enter into the spiral, and any of the students who have studied with me, I think I've been using the spiral analogy now for a really long time. But there's an entry point in this analogy that it's kind of like the Fool in the tarot, where we set off, which we would now call unconscious incompetence. I prefer to say the Fool, because I think the Fool in the tarot, and sorry, because I know that sometimes I use language about things that have meanings that people have been taught that it means something like devil worship or whatever, but it's not. These are archetypal images that have existed throughout time. And, so this image, the tarot imagery is actually just these archetypes. Let's leave it at that and not think of it as a divination tool or whatever freaks people out. But actually, the archetype of the Fool, what I appreciate is that the Fool has and it's the 0, which is the complete circle, which is, when you enter into something with idealism and integrity and the intention to do something, you enter into it without real bias. You step into it with the possibility of everything. You also step into it with complete naivete of what you're about to enter into, right? And so that means that people in homeopathy education are accepting the beginner's mind to say, we will be responsible for your journey, because you have to be guided both with your own sort of developmental process, but you have to be guided so that you don't go off the rails. And that's really important. And I think that's where the discipline inherent in disciple is to say that there also needs to be transparency to say, this is what's expected of you. And I think that when people get into education where there's a guru mentality, there's a lot of like, you're looking to the guru who can only know, whereas each of us know inside of ourselves when we are doing something that's appropriate. Right? Anyway, but when we go on that spiral, so if we look at it just through the lens of the academic structure of a homeopathy program, what I always saw it to be was you enter into the spiral and you have to learn the basics and you have to develop confidence. So instead of starting with sulfur, which goes to the core of chronic disease theory, it's like that it could blow your circuits if you're not ready. But you also can't take it all in. But you can master arnica for bruises and bryonia and rhus tox and all of the therapeutic indications. And that spiral that we go on, that we take people on, actually mimics Hahnemann's experiences, where he started with everything being equal and then realize that acute and chronic disease are very different. So we take our students on that spiral, going in, learning philosophy, learning how to ground yourself in this, and learning the reproducibility through very basic, safe, acute prescribing until you get to the center of that spiral. And when I draw that spiral, I have the yin and yang symbol in the center, which is we reach the balance point. And we ask ourselves, both as instructors and as students, to be present in this idea that Hahnemann had, that an individual has the capacity to achieve this greater health and balance. And once we get to that place, we go back out and we reproduce that spiral again. And we address every concept now through a much higher potency. That is through the lens of Hahnemann's theory of chronic disease, where we deconstruct problems at a much higher level, because the students are ready for that. And they don't do that until, semesters 2, 3, and 4, but with that constant application process in clinic, right?
Yep.
Was that a lot?
No, that's not a lot. It's a great model of describing what it is that we do.
But that was the model that you and I kept coming to as we were taking a bazillion pieces of paper and putting them on the table and having rolls of butcher paper to say, what are the bite-sized pieces that people can master along the way, and how do you keep people interested in, because people come and they know in their hearts that there's so much more.
What it highlights to me is that, because curriculum is to create a curriculum from scratch is like a gift. If you've got a blank piece of paper.
Oh my gosh!
And then you realize. What I've realized along the way is that so often it is a great gift. It's a beautiful new opportunity, but in fact you're put into a dinghy with a few holes in it, and actually the boat that is going to carry you is maybe lacking in integrity, or at least structural integrity. What I mean is that sometimes you get an opportunity to create a curriculum and there's no money, or the institution's heading in this direction, or there's a change of ownership or something, and it's like just being so often I realized that and to create the curriculum, because the perfect curriculum in homeopathy would be 85 years long.
Yeah, totally.
Right?
Yeah.
And involve, delving into significant depth, medical science, astronomy, geology,
chemistry,
and history,
yeah,
and mythology, and it would just be.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, you've got the realities of
a couple thousand hours.
You got students that want to get out, they want to make a return on their investment, like they want to
and fair enough, and they should,
as they should. And so it's extraordinary. It's multifaceted. I think there are some people that are really, really, really skilled in many areas of that process, but I don't know that it's that often you meet someone that's really skilled in all of them. I know for a fact that I'm not, but I know where I'm not skilled, and I can certainly ask. But I do know these days the fundamentals. Are you teaching? But are they learning?
Are they learning? That's the thing.
Tell me about your assessment, and if you're assessing people, then where's your moderation? Where's the reflection?
Right.
Where's the self-improvement? Where's the quality improvement process cycle? Show me.
Oh my gosh.
And so that sort of learning, education, and a bit of educational compliance smacked me around in the side of the head so much, and I sort of feel that what we've created is a beautiful balance, a dynamic balance.
Yeah.
It's always moving.
Oh my gosh, every summer.
Yeah.
Well, actually, what I want to go back to is, when just a little historical grounding in this is that, this program, when you and I had the opportunity to recreate it, we didn't get to just start fresh because we had enrolled cohorts.
Exactly.
And then, and then we had someone who was retiring who asked us to take on their students. Oh, actually, can I use this moment to dispel a little mythology? And I would really love for people to know this, because I hear time and again people think we've bought schools. If anybody, first of all, that would assume that we actually had the money to buy something. But we've never ever once done that, nor have we ever sort of taken over something. And I think what has happened is, well, a couple of times people have retired and asked us if we would shepherd their students through. And I think that's a much better way to look at it. So if any of you anybody who's listening hears that, please feel free to, ask people who have that idea to call us so we could talk about it, because that is just not 100% not a part of our journey. In fact, we've assumed debt at any turn, that we've assumed responsibility for, for other people's students, because it takes a lot of work. Because what brought me to that was when we had the opportunity to create our own curriculum, we also had to teach through everyone who was coming through our program. And anytime students have come into our program, we also have to make sure that they get whatever they need, because every program teaches differently. And that's not a right-wrong thing. But we've run our curriculum, you counted it, is it 24 times?
It's 24.
24 times. And so I think that's also important, because even though, there might be schools who have been around for more years as a consistent institution, how many students have they put through, and how many times have they done that reflective process on their education? But at one time, we were running, I think, 5 different versions of the curriculum. It wasn't until, I think, 2018
that the weekend school had finished.
The weekend school had finished, and we were moving through with all of our own. But this also means that when we take people on, anybody who comes to our school who has studied before, we don't ask them to pay again for what they've already paid. We just knock that right off the top. Because if someone is willing to relearn something, or not relearn, but see it through a different lens, I don't think they should have to pay for that.
Did you do that? Did you have to do that?
Yeah.
No. But because you moved to school a couple of times.
I started over. I started from scratch 3 times.
And you started paying from scratch 3 times?
I started paying from scratch 3 times. But I also was, weird. I didn't mind starting over. It's funny, I always feel like I'll never think I know enough. Maybe that's why I say when you're confident in your competence or whatever. I don't ever want to be overconfident, because the mystery is too great.
I'd love to remember the name of the compliance woman at Endeavour.
Who yelled at you?
Oh my God!
I'm sure you could find her name by looking in the freezer where you... How is this thing like if he's having a difficult time with the person, he puts their name in an ice cube tray so that it could just,
Anyway,
I like that.
But I remember this experience. Speaking to the point that you just made about students arriving with knowledge or, assuming the responsibility of teaching out. Sometimes it's called a teach out. A student that's coming from a different school, or if your program is changing, what do you do with the students within? So I think it is, the educational term is a teach out. I had to learn that and really quick. And so what I learned how to do was write an educational pathway, an independent learning contract for a student, so that they were still learning exactly what they needed to, but honouring where they were in the program that was being taught out, and then transitioning them into this program. And, to do that, you needed to make sure that they were learning the right topics, the correct number of hours, and the right depth. Because if it was a degree program and they were coming from a competency-based program, then you had to revisit a couple of topics, And anyway, that simple skill, it's not difficult, but that simple skill of writing a pathway of advanced standing or, using recognition of prior learning and stuff, is just something that it has been the way that you and I have been able to navigate the incoming of students from a school that's closing, or
helping students to sort of get what they need. And it's so funny. I don't know. It sort of makes me sad that there isn't a way that the educational leadership can come together. I mean, we're doing this with people around the world, but in the United States, it's been tough for us. But we are really fortunate to be having conversations with the faculty of homeopathy. So this is the medical homeopaths in the UK. I mean, one of the most venerated institutions in homeopathy education. We are working together with them to, you're doing the heavy lifting on sort of creating parity to make sure that, there's external moderation and looking at curriculum. I mean, we're able to do this with the naturopaths, that we're having the conversations. I mean, it's the very germ of a conversation that we've had, but with the AIH, with medical homeopathy, asking questions about how can we create the next generation of leadership in homeopathy by creating educational standards and educational performance for, that allows us to do really good work. And it just makes me sad because it's perceived as competition. When I just see competition as a low vibration, whereas when we work together, then a rising tide floats all boats. Like I don't understand it anyway, but that's me. But that's something that we are trying really hard to do, is to take what we've learned from having to be accountable for student performance and to work with other institutions so that we can all talk to each other and say, hey, how are you, learning from each other's experience, how are you getting students to be able to work within the complexities of X, Y, or Z? Right? And this is something when I was listening to one of our podcasts in my studio the other day.
One of our podcasts.
I was.
You're the only one.
That's okay. I mean, it's still, I learned from it. And what I learned is that, there's a way in which you and I are having these conversations around, and with our colleagues, around how can we sort of work within these larger institutions now that homeopathy is a much more visible part of the medical paradigm. And how can we do that so that we are, you said you were, the podcast I was listening to, I forget which one, it was a research podcast. It's the one where you were talking about how we are not the sole providers for our clients. We are part of an array of inputs. Therefore, outcomes need to be measured, taking into account everybody's, input. And I had said, one of the things I always worry about is that we like to have the kudos when somebody gets well and say, oh, it's the homeopathy. And when they don't get well, oh, it's because they're doing X, Y, and Z.
Exactly.
Right? Whereas I think if we're able to have these really honest conversations with ourselves, and in homeopathy education, we can do that. And so one of the places where we started, so there are two other questions that I just want us to talk about a little bit.
Yeah.
Which is, who can be successful in homeopathy, and it's not always who you think. And the second one is about technology, which I only want to touch on a little bit if we can. But
if we're only going to talk about it like for an hour and a half, I'll need another 8 hours to.
Well, that's why this podcast is ongoing, but it's getting on time for Sunday brunch, which is my favorite part of the week. My absolute favorite part of the week.
All right, let's hurry this up.
So, who comes to study homeopathy? I mean, everybody. And it's amazing how you can never know who's going to be.
I did that survey once, and it was my case management workshop I did with Kim at Whole Health Now.
Yeah.
I think it was 2012 or something. And there's study groups still that get together. There's a Facebook group called Case Management. From that time.
Really?
It's still active.
I didn't know that.
I mean, I was never invited, but the students that were involved in that,
right,
liked it, and so, but I just gathered that information, and I can still remember the slide because I teach it every now and again. But there was an aeroplane engineer, there was a post-production videographer, there was a physician. There was a homeschool mum. There was a dentist. There was...
Wow.
You get the idea. Just an extraordinary, an unbelievable classroom.
It's like those things when you play the game, who would make for the best dinner party?
Right.
And you have all these different people. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what a homeopathy classroom looks like.
Well, that's exactly what our classroom looks like. And so, that breadth, we attract that breadth.
We as a modality.
Yeah, correct.
Because it's the inquisitive person who comes to homeopathy.
So what are the qualities? Are you asking what are the qualities of the person that will do well? Or are you asking how do we predict who's going to be a thriving practitioner thereafter?
I'm not sure that I asked a really clear question. I want your input on what that looks like to you. What have you seen?
Well, what I've seen is that those folks that are the nurse practitioners and the physicians don't always make the best homeopaths initially. There's a struggle, and that experience actually comes from often teaching the naturopaths homeopathy.
Yeah.
Where, in one class on a Monday at 10 o'clock, they're learning that when you've got this clinical indication, give this supplement.
Right.
And then they go to the homeopathy class at 12 o'clock.
Yeah,
and
it's
they're
when
learning,
reductionism smacks into holism.
Well, that's exactly it.
Yeah.
And so, it is, to an extent, a degree of schizophrenia that needs to be just teased apart a little bit so that the reductionistic allopathic perspective can accommodate a true understanding of our view of what symptoms are.
Well, this is like how with clients or even with students who have along their healing journey encountered functional medicine.
Yeah.
Which it's like, okay, so
functional medicine and nutritional medicine and functional medicine are 2 steps away from and on the complementary quote alternative or complementary side of things. Homeopathy is not 7 steps away.
Yeah.
It is, and it takes more. But to the question, I think that I've often seen that. I was going to say, and I don't mean this in any sort of biased way, but reductionistically starting or minded people often struggle more, and that means that some folks in the classroom, and I'm thinking, I can think of some stellar homeschool mums at the moment in our classrooms are just flying.
Home educators.
Home educators.
I love that. That's
home educators.
I mean, that term, the homeschool mom, is just a respectful term for these. You think about. I think about this like from I didn't homeschool my kids. They went through the Waldorf or Steiner system. But I look at those teachers with such awe because they take them from first grade, from being, 6 years old until they are, graduating from 8th grade. So all through primary school.
Yep.
And they teach most subjects, and this is what home educators do. I mean, obviously there are co-ops and they're doing, but the amount of knowledge and how to deconstruct a problem and put it back together to be able to take people through that, I just find. I mean, to me, I'm in awe of that, and I think that those moms, those folks, I don't know that we've had a homeschool dad, so I guess that's why we say anyway. But those people just amaze me with. Not just the knowledge, but there's an inquisitive nature because they're accustomed to the classical paradigm.
They're managers. They know how to manage situations, difficult situations. I'm talking about, say, kids or complex chronic cases. But the thing that I've noticed is that where people come from, it just is the starting point.
Yeah.
I think I would say 98%, 95%, 90%, I don't know. But a significant proportion of the folks that come to homeopathy study and move into practice have had are wounded, have had some significant challenges with their health or the health of a loved one.
Yeah.
Their kid.
Now it's a lot of their children.
Yeah. And then I'd say that they are able to, through that cauldron of study, begin to integrate aspects of that wound, so that it's not the thing which is on the outside that they're leading with. And that makes a beautiful practitioner. That makes a skilled, knowledgeable person with all the attributes you need.
Totally, because I think that empathy and compassion is so prevalent in people who know they've seen or felt the suffering, and then they find a path to healing. I think that becomes sort of a driver in the passion. I'm thinking about how, in our program at AHE, we've got any given classroom is around, in the entirety of our student population, it's always around 20 to 25% licensed medical professionals. And one of the things that's really interesting to me, and this is kind of apropos of what you were talking about, is that initial struggle, because they've got to translate how they've learned into homeopathy. But there's this point at which you realize that they've integrated it and that there's no more separation, or that there's it becomes this really big potentization because they're able to apply both things. And I'm using an example from a clinic we had the other day, and I think I might have talked about this example in our last podcast.
Oh, the case of the kid with the skin.
Yeah, and where Katie, one of our students, who is a specialty level nurse practitioner with a specialty in treating allergies, of which eczema is part of that allergy profile.
Shout out to Katie.
Yeah, I mean, it was great because she was able to sort of, she does a really good job. I like using her as an example of someone who can sit on that pointy end of something that's difficult to say, I've got my allopathic hat on and this is the homeopathy hat, and and goes through that, the tension in that, but always comes out with a good clinical decision. And that's what, I think that's what, we're looking for, so I think it's time for us to kind of wrap up. I want to talk about just one last point, and let's skip technology for another time.
See, I'm so ecstatic you said that, because once I start, I can't stop.
I know.
But I want it next time.
Yeah, so I just want to talk about what you and I, as we were making our chai and planning for, our discussion today, one of the things we were talking about was how there's this way in which homeopathy education, that sort of spiritual aspect of it, and and how there's something so beautiful about this idea that homeopathic medicine, or when a person gets relieved of the burden that they've been carrying, especially, we have one of the only modalities one of the few modalities that allows the mental and emotional burden to be freed. And Hahnemann talks about how in aphorism 9, once we break through that, we have the capacity to reach our highest potential. And I think some homeopathy education focuses so much on that. And as we talked about sort of the hub and spokes of how the core of homeopathy through a game of telephone became the ways in which some teachers sort of express their own special sauce, which oftentimes has so much of a spiritual bent to it. One of the things that I love about our program is that I think that spiritual thing, whether people know it or not, attracts them. And one of the things that we don't have to worry so much about in our community is that people come sort of intact in a way. We have so many people who are observant, who are engaged in their cultural and religious practice, right? And whether that is, in any given classroom, you have people who are observant in, 5 faiths who are sitting and learning together. And what happens is that the truth that goes beyond this application. So you don't have to teach like it used to be. So, all anybody has to do is look at a picture of Al teaching in the 90s with those hippie outfits on, and not even wearing shoes. And there was one particular...
It was a hot day.
Fair enough, on the beanbag chair. But one of the things that brought people together was that there was always this sort of spiritual component. There was sort of the hippie, tradition in homeopathy, and it's a bit liberating now that we don't. It's not about one tradition, and the conversations that happen that are about reaching one's highest potential. It's like a homeopathy teacher doesn't have to. You don't have to teach that. You're not the guru. Everybody has their own way of going through the journey to their own individual elevation to their highest potential. And having people from multiple traditions allows us to move beyond this sort of one note kind of hippie homeopathy into it's sort of transcended beyond it. Because and I think that this might have come up in a podcast before that Hahnemann had. Yeah, it did. It was the podcast when we were in the kitchen when we were talking about we were talking about chronic diseases, and it was on Imbolc, right? And we talked about Candlemas and all of the ways in which the transcendence of one tradition allows for a much higher level of conversation, because that's sort of taken care of, right? And so what happens in homeopathy school now is that the discipline can take place, because we're not trying to bring people along into some, whatever thing, but rather we can teach sort of the basics, and each person is potentizing in their own way, and the education transcends that. Yeah. And Hahnemann's teachings were not about one tradition. And it's not like, I can't come to homeopathy school because I'm Orthodox and this, that, or the other thing. It's like, no, it's actually, it transcends beyond that. And you see that in our classroom, which I just love.
Think there's a richness in our classroom.
Oh
it's
my
an honor.
gosh.
I love it.
Yeah, it honors it so much.
I love the diversity.
Right? And so can we do another thing on homeopathy education? Would that another podcast?
Sure.
Okay, because this
is
the
focus on what?
Well, I think there's technology.
Yeah, and student support.
The
clinical
hearts
training.
And minds.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, clinical training. We've talked about that a few times, but man, so much more. Okay. I think now it's time for brunch. My favorite part of every Sunday.
All right, looks like we're done, folks. Hey, have a great week.
Thanks for listening. Thanks for caring about homeopathy.
Take care.
Hey there. My name is Kaylee, and I'm a graduate of the Academy of Homeopathy Education. As a homeschooling mother of young children, I wanted to find a way that I could pursue my dream of becoming a professional homeopath. The faculty at AHE welcomed me with open arms and helped me find my path. If you've been waiting for a sign to apply, this is it. AHE is offering an early enrollment discount to help you get started. Learn more at ahe.online.